We at Working Class History are very excited today to be launching a new podcast series, WCH Crime, where true crime meets the struggle for a better world. In these occasional mini-series, we're going to be looking at cases where ordinary people have faced criminal charges for standing up for their beliefs, or where they've been framed or even killed by the state. We've been working on this series for almost a year and have put a lot of hours into it. We're also committed to having no adverts or corporate donors and having all of our content be available to everyone. With these episodes and over the next year, we're going to be putting a lot more time into our podcast than previously, but this will only be sustainable in the long run if we get more support from you, our listeners, on Patreon. More info on this at the end of the episode and in the show notes. We hope you enjoy it.
It's the case of the successful two-man mutiny aboard the American munitions ship Columbia Eagle.
Two crewmen were armed when they took control of the cargo ship.
The hijackers, meanwhile, went on.
When we got the guns out to clean them, I got up and I told Clyde, I'll be right back. I'm going to go to the bathroom before we do this. Looked at the mirror and I said to myself, you may not live through this. This may be your last few minutes.
This is Al. It was 1970 and he's a sailor on a ship carrying thousands of tons of napalm into the Vietnam War. I think it's helpful to start with a bit of background here. So napalm is basically a highly flammable sticky jelly made by mixing chemicals with gasoline. Early on in the conflict, US and South Vietnamese ground forces used napalm in flamethrowers to burn villages that they saw as being sympathetic to the Viet Cong and to clear bunkers, as even if flames couldn't penetrate an entire bunker, they still consumed all of the oxygen and suffocated anyone inside. Later on, US bombers began dropping napalm bombs, burning and killing untold thousands, including many civilians. Napalm sticks to human skin and melts off the flesh. The only way to put it out is to smother it, which then spreads the burning jelly around and burns an even bigger area. Al knew this when he signed on to the vessel, the SS Columbia Eagle. In fact, it was the reason he chose it. What Al was about to do that day, on March 14th, 1970, would change his life forever. But at that very moment, Al's mind was on other things. What his future children would think of him if he turned back now.
I will never, ever be able to see or look my children in the face when they ask me, what did you do to stop the war? Dad, you will be able to say that you did your duty to stop it. You did your best to stop it. And I walked around, turned around, went out the door, got the gun, must move.
Before we get into the detail of what happened, we're going to go back a bit. There are a lot of unexpected twists and turns in this story, but it is a true story, as told to us by Alvin Glatkowski, who everyone calls Al. We think it's an important story, as not only is it one of the only mutinies in US history, but it was perhaps the single most spectacular act of protest against the Vietnam War. Al was born in 1949 in the military town of Norfolk, Virginia.
I grew up in the military, and we were expected to go into the military.
Al's family believed in the American military, that it was generally a force for good in the world, and so did Al. But in the mid-1960s, America was in the middle of the Vietnam War, and Al was a teenager. In Norfolk, a city built around one of the biggest military bases in the world, there wasn't much vocal opposition to the war, but across the country, opposition was steadily growing louder. Al was too young to be drafted, but some of his friends were eligible. They started to go to demonstrations and teach-ins.
I ended up going with them to the draft boards and trying to slow down the progress of the workers at the draft board to process paperwork. And I didn't realize at the time that was really a guerrilla action. I mean, it was just something where we went and sat on their desk or walked over to the file cabinets and started rummaging through the files. Nobody expected that in the military town that I lived in, that would ever occur. And the women working there were very polite and said, please don't do this. We get off of our desk. One of my buddies was rifling through the file cabinet. Another one was sitting on the other desk. The only difference between him and I is he was sitting and I was laying across the desk. And it wasn't until we started rifling through the files, that's when they said, well, look, if you guys don't stop, we're going to have to call security. I don't think that any of us ever really thought it out. We just went in and did this. And so that was my first anti-war statement, I believe.
And it wouldn't be his last. In 1967, age 17, Al signed up for the Merchant Marine. The Merchant Marine is primarily a civilian body of mostly privately owned vessels, but in times of war, it can be an auxiliary to the US Navy, and it carries personnel and cargo for the military. So Al travelled extensively, and this exposed him to more organised opposition to the war in big cities. He remembers one time in particular in Antwerp, Belgium.
We had some time to kill. And so I went sightseeing and met students and was constantly being asked questions by people about the war. I met some Swedish students that were there, and they spoke multiple languages. I was amazed. I can barely speak English, let alone anything else. But more importantly, what was amazing to me was the activity against the war, which I thought was more than where I was from, because I hadn't been to any major big cities on the Northeast coast other than the Merchant Marine Training School in Brooklyn, New York. I was slowly being indoctrinated and having my eyes open to the views of international views of what America was doing abroad.
While Al was away at sea, back at home, groups like churches, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, known as the MOB, had stepped up their opposition to the war. The trip to Antwerp strengthened Al's growing opposition too, and this continued when he got back.
When I came back to the States, I had the wonderful experience to be in New York City. The MOB-1, Mobilization in the War, was doing a march led by Stokely Carmichael to the United Nations.
It was another opportunity for Al to learn about the war, but after the rally at a hotel, meeting with other demonstrators, he heard things he hadn't heard before, and he didn't want to believe.
A lot of people were looking for places to stay and spend the night before they went back home and stuff. So I opened my hotel room up as a crash pad and had the opportunity once again to listen to a lot of stuff, a lot of things about the war in Vietnam, but being raised on a military base, I was extremely dubious about it. Oh yes, that's not the way things are. That can't be happening that way.
Even though Al opposed the war and kept going to protests, he found it hard to accept some of the extreme things his peers were saying about the conflict, until he attended one demonstration that really shook his worldview to the core.
Some of us, we decided to go up to a demonstration. It was in Washington, D.C. in October, if I'm not mistaken, of '67. I had signed a pledge to be a pacifist, and with the possibility of being arrested. We marched all the way from downtown Washington, D.C. to the Pentagon. And when we got there, it was already surrounded by the military, and the soldiers had fixed bayonets. And I don't know if they had live rounds or not, but I would suspect they did.
While this was all going on, some demonstrators were giving speeches.
It was during those speeches that I started they were saying stuff that I was trained and raised to not believe in. We're not going to bomb civilians. We're not going to kill. That's not what the military does. We don't burn people. We're there to protect everybody and to try to defend something. And I started to question what was going on there.
As Al was hearing these speeches, the soldiers, with the bayonets, were closing in on the demonstrators.
So they had their bayonets down, but they were doing a two-step march. One forward, half step back, one forward, half step back. If you stayed, you were going to get bayoneted. Oftentimes they would sort of slow down a little bit and move aside, make a little hole, and the U.S. Marshals would grab somebody by the hair, the arm, clothing, or whatever, and drag them out and arrest them. And then that was just another eye-opener for me. Somewhere in there, I think it was when I was about ready to be bayoneted, while sitting on the ground, that my view of pacifism changed. That's when I moved from where the pacifists were over to where the people were with civil disobedience. And I didn't think I would ever do anything like that, but I became I started paying attention and watching what was going on and moving rapidly from one area to another area as the police and the military would step in and arrest people, drag them out between the legs of the soldiers. that's where I threw my first can of tear gas. They're not cold, by the way; they're hot. When someone shoots a can of tear gas at you, and it hits the ground just a few feet from you, what are you going to do? You run away?
No, Al wasn't the sort of person to run away. He did want to find out, though, whether all these terrible things he was hearing about the Vietnam War were true. When trying to figure out what's going on in the world, most of us do things like watch the news, read the papers, or do research. But Al wasn't most people.
And when I returned back to Norfolk, Virginia, I fell in with some of the FDSers and started asking questions. And I think it was so confusing, I didn't know whether it was true or not. And it was shortly after that that I signed on to a ship that was going to Vietnam because I really wanted to go see for myself. I wanted to witness what was happening. I needed to find out if what I was being told was true or not. That was a hard decision. As soon as I had signed on the vessel, I went back to where my friends were and told them I'd be leaving in such and such day. And immediately I started getting the cold shoulder from all my friends. And that was unexpected. I wasn't prepared that they would drop me like a hot potato.
Al's decision cost him a lot of his friends, but he felt he needed to know the truth. So he got a post on a ship transporting military equipment to Vietnam. Over there, although he was a civilian, he found himself in the same docks and bars as service people.
I was able to hang out with a lot of GIs. And the interesting thing was if you smoke a joint with somebody, they opened up a little bit and started to talk about what their experiences and what was going on with them, and that they were never raised to kill people. And, they never expected to be where they're at doing what they were doing. They were fighting farmers that had, they had nothing, and the soldiers had everything, and here they are killing people. And
Al learned what the rest of the American public learned later, that many Vietnam vets were unsure about the mission they were sent to do. And what made it worse for them was that many soldiers couldn't tell who the enemy was.
As you're walking down the street, you didn't know if this person was a Viet Cong or not. The next thing you know, a bomb's going off in a restaurant.
All these pressures led many GIs to join the anti-war movement and start resisting the war effort in Vietnam itself. We talked to some veterans about this in our episodes 10 and 11.
I met different soldiers that were having nervous breakdowns. It was pretty interesting to listen to these guys talk and tell these things. What was shocking to me was that they were telling the truth. And it's exactly, not the exact same thing, but similar things that were being said back at the demonstrations in D.C. and other places. And so listening to them made me realize that, oh yes, it really is this bad.
At one point, Al came across a relocation camp, as we discussed with Noam Chomsky in our episode 14. These were essentially concentration camps for the civilian population, built to keep out the influence of the Viet Cong.
They've got a little town in there, a shanty town. People wanted to go in, and you would find ways to get smuggled in, either through a cut in the fence or sometimes on a truck that's going in with MPs. And I did this a couple of times, and it puts you in a strange place when you're in a village that's surrounded by machine gun towers, and the people are scared of you. They're terrified. And it opened my eyes up to some things that I've never heard any of that being discussed in any demonstration. I just got to see things that I was unprepared for. I was kind of naive and young and just didn't know about it. None of my family ever spoke. They were in World War II, Korea, the Cold War. None of them ever spoke about those type of things. You just didn't hear it. Most military guys come back, and the only time that they would sit and talk was when they were with their buddies. They didn't talk to their kids or their families, or their wives. They didn't hear it. They held it inside. And so to have this opportunity to see and listen and hear what was going on and to actually witness it changed my life.
Despite all the valuable knowledge Al had acquired, when he got back, his friends still couldn't accept that he had, in their eyes, essentially supported the war effort by working as a merchant mariner.
Nobody agreed me. Nobody wanted to say hi to me or anything. None of my friends. I remember them accusing me of being a baby killer, but they were doing it just as a gross way of trying to get me to not go the first time. And after that, when I came back, maybe one or two of them were being nasty, particularly nasty to me, and made some comment like that. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with me. And in the process, when sitting with them and talking with them and things, they would tell me, well, you could have done it a different way. You could have done stuff like, I asked him, well, what are you doing against war? And I went there, and at least I've seen it. I can come back and talk about it because I've seen it. I went there. I got tired of listening to them badmouth me, and I just started going on the offensive and said, what the fuck are you doing to stop the war? You're not fucking doing a goddamn thing. Why don't you? I pointed to one of them. I said, what, you're working in a tin factory and you're using a marker to put the bomb symbol at the corner of the temp? I said, well, how effective and what is that doing to stop war?
While Al tried to process all the information about the war, he remained in the Merchant Marine and continued on with his life.
I was in college. I was trying to take college classes, got married, and was settling down.
That is, until he met Clyde McKay.
I had met the sailor at the Union Hall, and his name was McKay, Clyde McKay. And we had gotten to talking and stuff and went out to dinner, lunch, etc. a couple times. And in the course of staying a week in the Union Hall, we became closer friends. And then the next week, a little bit closer. And by the third week, we both were talking about the Cuban Revolution and things that were going on in Africa and other places.
But what really caught their attention, and perhaps also changed the course of their lives, was news of a ship that had sunk on its way to Vietnam. It was an ammunition ship called the SS Badger State. It exploded and sank, taking with it 26 of its 40 crew. Eventually, the captain testified that a large wave hit the ship and caused its cargo to explode, but Clyde and Al had a different theory.
So there were sailors in the Union Hall that were talking about it because we had updates on it. There was constant postings on it. But there was a lot of speculation that there were anti-war hippies on that ship, and they sunk it. And we were there one day talking about it, and we made some comment, but, it probably wasn't some hippie. It was probably some leftist that decided enough was enough. And boy, the Seafarers International Union Hall is not the place to do that. We were told, you need to put that in a jar and put the lid on it and get it out of here. So we went out into a local bar and sit down and we talked. And we began to dance around the issue without asking each other straight up, would you be willing to participate in a mutiny? Clyde asked me if I had a gun, and I told him, no, I don't. He said, well, I do. And he goes, what would it take for you to get a gun? And I said, well, right now I'm pretty broke, but maybe we can find one.
They got to talking about what they'd actually have to do to prepare for a mutiny.
There's a lot of bravado that goes on with young boys. We just sort of kept pushing each other.
Until they were serious enough that they might actually do it. Maybe they'd actually pull off a mutiny. So that's it for part one. The relevant levels of our Patreon supporters can listen to the rest of this series now, as well as bonus audio. So if you don't already, you can support us, get early access to episodes and other benefits at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. For everyone else, future parts will be out each week. Future series of WCH Crime we're working on include one on the execution of radical songwriter Joe Hill and on the Reichstag fire, which helped propel the Nazis to absolute power. The regular Working Class History podcast will also be back soon, with episodes in the works on lesbians and gays support the miners, the movement against the Vietnam War, and more. Thanks so much to our patrons for making this podcast possible. This episode was written and produced by WCH and Daniel Waldorf. Audio editing by Daniel Waldorf. Music composed by Austin Coulson. Catch you next time.